Mike Stemmle. Welcome to Tech Talk with Daniel.
Hi, Daniel. It's great to be here.
You know, after a few decades of me playing Sam & Max adventure games and you creating them, I thought it was high time we met.
Well, I always love meeting Sam & Max fans, and I have enjoyed creating Sam & Max content about once every 10 years for the past 3 decades.
Mm-hmm. But before we talk about the Sam & Max games, let's rewind a bit. How did you get into game design?
I got into game design in high school, futzing around with my Apple IIe. I made an adventure game set in my high school just for fun with cheesy vector graphics. During college, I was a CS major, and I got hooked onto a old product, Silicon Beaches, world builder for the Macintosh. Wonderful little editor that made cheesy graphic adventure games. And so I was churning out shareware games on that. And then I hadn't even thought about professionally making games because I didn't know that was a thing you could do until a friend of mine from college got a call back at Lucasfilm Games. Had to turn them down because he'd already gotten a job at Apple. But he said, "Hey, you should go talk to this Mike guy I know." And that's how I landed my interview and sent me spiraling down this long journey of degradation and despair.
What can you tell us about those games that you've created using World Builder?
I made a few. I was in the middle of making one set in a haunted amusement park when I got hired. I had made another one that was set in cyberspace. And then I made like this massive, largest game ever built with that tool. It was on 2 or 3 discs that was just a rambling adventure game all about the Stanford band. And it was like, yeah, go figure. I had the Superman's Fortress of Solitude, the Batcave, Oz, Alice in Wonderland, and just was a complete rampaging peek into my id at the time. So yeah, they were very silly and a lot of fun.
And so you were using licensed IPs in addition to your original ones.
Yes, I was, because I didn't know any better. And, it was just as the shareware checks started rolling in, such as they were, I got hired at Lucas and moved, and the rest of the checks never found me. So there's a whole bunch of people out there who are still waiting for their secret password key to get the to get the secret prize in the game that never got them.
Well, at least you didn't get any cease and desist letters in the mail. So
nothing that bad. It was all kind of obliquely referenced, mostly.
Super guy.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Instead of Superman,
yes.
Yeah.
That kind of thing, definitely.
And when did you start working at LucasArts?
That would be June of 90. That sounds about right. Yeah, 1 year after I graduated.
And what was your first day at LucasArts like?
It was a little bewildering because when I started, we were all still working up at Skywalker Ranch. So that was weird, being, in this quaint house on Skywalker Ranch, meeting various people, like Sean Clark and Tammy Borowick and that cohort of junior league scumlets, and sussing each other out and what our interests were. And and then they pretty much just got us started on the Scum training tool, which had Sam & Max in it. We had cheesy little versions of Sam & Max even then that we could animate, and realizing pretty quickly, I can do this. This isn't hard. This isn't hard programming by and large. I can handle this. Now I just got to be funny.
It's harder.
Comedy is harder. Yeah, it's harder to make someone laugh than to make them cry. That's for sure. Um, I've learned that over the years. But yeah, and it was great. And the older crew, the crew that had been around for a little while, Grossman and Schaefer, they were pretty cool with us, and it got us integrated into the group fairly quickly. Hal Barwood, being pretty much immediately took on his role as elder statesman in the group, and took care of all of us youngsters. I think he probably paid for most of my lunches for about 2 years. He was an absolute great guy to be hang around with. So it was fun, and they cautioned me on the first day. Well, we're moving out of the ranch in about a month. And frankly, that didn't matter that much to me, because as nice as the ranch is, it's like isolated, and it was like this 25-minute drive out there every day. It's like, oh, that's okay, I can go with that, being in a regular office. And it turned out the new office space was like 3 blocks from my crummy apartment that I'd moved into, so I got to walk to work every day for a few years.
You could have gone home to eat lunch.
I could have, except for when I say crummy apartment, I'm underselling it. It was a horrible apartment. As I was, it was what I could afford in Marin County on a starting game designer's pay, which wasn't that much back then.
And what was the first project they assigned you to at LucasArts?
The first project that actually went out the door was something called the Passport to Adventure, which was basically one disc that had samples of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and Loom, and Monkey Island, which hadn't been finished yet. I believe I got the relatively easy Last Crusade bit, because that game was in the can and had easy to use scum code. I think Tammy got the cherished Monkey Island bit. And was it Sean? I think Sean, that poor SOB, had to tiptoe through the Loom code, which in hindsight was just fine, but for a starting scumlet, it was doing torturous things to the code to make the little musical charts flow properly. But we all pulled it off, and we shoved it onto I think it was a 720 disc. I don't even think it was a 1.4 meg disc. So that was our first project, and worked pretty well.
Passport to Adventure is my introduction to the Monkey Island series. That's where I played the demo of Monkey Island for the first time. And it's interesting because you're credited for working on the Secret of Monkey Island demo, and not for the Passport for Adventure. I was that. I could very well be wrong then. Maybe I did work on it. I'm credited for not credited for Passport to. I've definitely worked on Passport to Adventure. I may have worked on a Secret of Monkey Island separate demo. Because there were several versions of the demo. There's one where the jail is at the end of Low Street, and there's another one in which you can explore High Street as well, although in limited capacity. And so probably worked on one of these versions.
I probably worked on one of them, but I also worked on Passport to Adventure. It's credit on that one is sort of a nebulous thing anyway, because who knows? But I definitely worked on the Passport to Adventure. And then I probably chipped in a little on one of the Secret of Monkey Island demos, because we were all kind of doing little bits of that while the team finished up the game. And then very quickly I was put on to Fate of Atlantis after that. And that, as you probably, that took a long time.
But before Fate of Atlantis, back in 1990, you also worked on Night Shift, where you were credited for additional testing. Was this a part of? Was this a part of a pizza orgy, or were you an official playtester on this game?
I was probably, I mean, as much as anybody, I was doing official testing. But boy, I'd totally forgotten that. Yeah, I was probably doing that simultaneously while working on Fate. Basically, it wasn't a pizza orgy kind of thing. It was an ongoing thing, is trying to work out, where the bugs were and what was happening. But that was pretty much, entry level scumlets at the time were doing a lot of testing, just to get their feet wet in all the projects as well. And that was pretty cool. I'm going to stop swinging my chair because it's squeaking.
Thank you for that.
You're not, yes. Let's see. But yeah, I can't remember too much about testing Night Shift, but I can kind of picture myself in the room playing it a lot and trying to see what was going wrong with it. Not much was. It mostly worked at the time. Yeah, Night Shift. But
now, in the final version of The Secret of Monkey Island, you receive different forms of recognition across its various versions. In the DOS version, you're acknowledged for your role in graphics and artwork. Meanwhile, the Amiga version credits you for your contribution to Amiga art. And in the Mac and Sega CD versions, you're credited for your involvement in additional art. Could you clarify whether you actively created graphics for each of these versions, or if they just gave you diverse credits?
No. I think a lot of it has to do with, especially in the Amiga version. I was doing a lot. There was some upgrading of animation sprites. Upraising them to like 32 colors on occasion. A skill I was not at all appropriate for. I was not trained in, and I am quite sure that some of those sprites in the Amiga animation sprites are jankier than heck, because I was just doing pixel art in some way that I thought was cool, but I'm not a trained artist, as every artist I've ever worked with will tell you. But they needed people to do things, so I went and did some things. I probably worked on upgrading a couple of the icons here and there along the way as well. But back then, if you touched the game at all, you got a credit in some, official capacity, and which is a good thing. But yeah, it was pretty minimal work, all things considered. They had warm bodies that they had tasks that needed to be done, so I was put on it.
Additionally, you're also credited for additional testing in the DOS and Sega CD versions. Were you involved in the QA process?
I probably was. I think everybody was, in an effort to get things out the door. I probably didn't get to touch the code that much, although it would have been trivially easy to make some of the fixes. But they just they were running us through to make sure that they because like I said, they had some scumlets lying around, some of whom weren't completely tasked yet, so they wanted us. They needed that game tested because it needed to get out the door.
And in my conversation with Noah Falstein, he told me that he knew The Secret of Monkey Island since the early 90s. Did Ron or anyone else ever tell you the secret?
No one ever told us, so which led us to make up a really bad one when we did Escape from Monkey Island. I don't. I kind of my sense is that Ron didn't. I don't think even knew until I think Ron figured it out somewhere over the last 10 or 15 years. And then put it down to paper and got his new game out based on that. And I think, The Secret of Monkey Island's basically, all the designers and friends we made along the way.
Hey, I chose the same one.
I love that cliche.
Well, and either Ron is lying or Noah is lying. So take your pick.
I am not going to get between the two of them on that. My memory is so hazy of those days that, I don't think I ever tried to corner Ron on whether he knew. Even when we came back and did Tales several years later, over at Telltale, we, basically made sure that we weren't treading on any toes, which is something we should have done for Escape, but I think it's all kind of lore that is probably not that important to know.
On Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, your credit is as a programmer. What was your contribution to the game in terms of programming?
It's interesting that we called ourselves programmers rather than scripters back then. I wrote a truckload of scum code for that game, and a truckload of dialogue. Hal probably had most of the really pithy lines, but except for the last one. The last one's mine. But Hal had most of the pithy lines. I had to wallpaper the rest of the game with a lot of the rest of the dialogue. So, Hal had this, great, insane vision for doing this, 3-path thing, and it was well on its way. Mostly kind of well on its way when I got there. I can't even remember. Maybe it wasn't. It was still early days. A lot of the rooms had been designed, but we had to design. There was still a lot of puzzle design work that had to be done. And so I was kind of, and I was running the programming effort on that, scripting effort. It's, barely coding. Running the scripting effort on that, writing a lot of the dialogue trees, figuring out how to make things work. And, eventually we got there. Took longer than we thought it would. Neither of us had finished a game before, a real game. So there was until the end of the project, the company had never had producers before. So we didn't have anybody to say, no, we got to finish, around here. So we just kept building it until finally, producers, that's a good idea. We should have some to kind of end a production. And I'm happy it went as long as it did because it made the game that much better in the end.
Wait, so if they didn't have any producers up to that point, how did games actually ship? Who decided to ship a game?
That is a quite good question. It depended on, the project leader kind of declaring it done, QA declaring it done, and probably the president of the company, whoever it was at the time, saying, no, we got to ship this. Once we had enough games in production, we started to try to actually have real schedules, which, worked to varying degrees over the years. But, it was the early days, when we were, one step removed from guys making games in their garages. The weird part is we were backed by George Lucas through all of that. So there's a phrase that there is something I say over and over again about that, is that, LucasArts was a company that if it had been any other game company would have collapsed like 4 times over during the time I was there. But it didn't, because, we essentially had this benevolent $1 billion, vault sitting behind us that kept feeding us money, even though we were losing money a lot of the time, as near as I can tell, especially those early years. Fortunately, we weren't losing a lot of money because we were small, but, most of those games, from what I understand, not being privy to the finances too much, most of those games didn't make a whole lot of money. So they were very niche products.
I think back in the day, the mottos of the company were "Don't lose money" and "Don't embarrass George." So
pretty much it. Yeah, we don't lose a lot of money. I think is closer to probably accurate. And don't embarrass George, which we, by and large didn't do. That would probably come later. But we were crazy and being allowed to do whatever we want. We'd write up these 3-page, 5-page pitches, and then we'd be off to the races, spending $500,000 to $1 million on a project and hoping it would sell, which is an interesting way to do business, not to be repeated in modern days.
Back in May, the CD-ROM talkie version of Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis celebrated its 30th anniversary. It was the first LucasArts game to offer a talkie version in addition to the earlier floppy disk version. I don't count Loom because it was developed externally and used CD audio instead of actual sound files. But did you consider the possibility of creating a talkie version during the original production of the game? And furthermore, what were your thoughts about the addition of voice to the then silent Scum games?
I have many conflicting thoughts. To answer your first question, no, at the time we weren't thinking about the talkie version. We were making a graphic text adventure. And the addition of voice in Indiana Jones, for Fate of Atlantis, I think it worked great because it's a pretty serious game. Indiana, it's light, but it's got serious topics. The voice acting is wonderful in it. Mm-hmm. Voice acting in all of our games has pretty much been top. Yeah. In all of the LucasArts games was top notch. And similarly with Sam and Max, we weren't thinking about voice at the time, so we would write these ridiculously jumbled jokes that don't translate well to voice, and that's part of that is increasingly became an issue. It's one of the reasons for Sam and Max we went to an icon-based dialogue system entirely so that we wouldn't kill the jokes, so that your responses to things were not telegraphed ahead of time. And so I think it still works with voice, but voice in the original Monkey Island with voice there, you always have a number of jokes in Monkey Island are jokes, are interface jokes in some ways. There's they list 4 different responses that more or less are the same, but with very funny variations. Okay, the joke's actually there in reading this list, not in what Guybrush now says. Mm-hmm. And comedic timing for me was always getting thrown off a little bit in the voice version, and even in the text version a little bit by, now I gotta wait for the thing I selected. There's another reason we did icon-based dialogue in Sam and Max, is so that there would be this thrill of what you said. What am I going to say when I hit the rubber duck? Oh, that funny thing. Okay. So I always, and this became a huge problem for me in later years with graphic adventures, is like as the acting got better and the verisimilitude of the graphics got better, the notion of waiting for dialogue just felt more and more painful. I mean, it is one of the better things Telltale ever did, was moving closer and closer to, well, let's just make interactive fiction and let's just make the dialogue keep going even if you don't say anything. We'll kind of chuck the pretense that we're doing a game and just have a free-flowing show where you can kind of dip in and make some choices as it goes on. And
they even added the ability to say nothing as one of the dialogue choices.
Yeah. Saying nothing is a choice. Yeah, doing nothing is a choice. Things will happen without you. And that's a great innovation. And and it was something we really couldn't do back then. We were kind of hamstrung by our little boxes that we'd put ourselves in. But I love, and I've loved, I've some of the best times of my career have been spent in the in the studio with our with dozens and dozens of voice actors now. So I wouldn't take that away for anything, but I really miss the two things. I miss the snappiness of text only. And I also miss the ability to edit quickly. If you don't like this joke, I'm going to go change it, and I don't have to go re-record it. I miss that. But that's just me being cheap.
Well, I think that Ron Gilbert and Tim Schafer mentioned in the past that with The Secret of Monkey Island, they were changing jokes or adding jokes up to the last minute. So
yep, I'm sure they were, and it hit the road. Although I can't think of any examples per se, I'm quite sure we were changing dialogue up till the end, adding a joke or two, and being able to, and I miss the meta jokes that having text affords you, like the listing 5 similar dialogue choices, or throwing up a wall of text for no particularly good reason, or the text that doesn't match the what you clicked and things like that. Those are all they're cheap jokes, but when applied judiciously, that you can get a good laugh out of them.
On Day of the Tentacle, you are credited for additional Scum programming. Did you take an active part in the development of the Scum engine for that game?
Just the programming, just scripting. I can't even remember which scene I was working on, but I definitely dipped in for a few weeks to help out with some scripting code. Nothing tricky or anything. Just we need somebody to get this basic wiring. I think I was actually doing a small dialogue tree somewhere in there, but it wasn't any of the major parts of it. Just sort of again, one of those, hey, we need somebody, you're around, maybe somebody's sick, maybe somebody's on vacation, but I have no memorable lines of dialogue from that, I don't think.
Maybe you've added some actions to the game or added some rooms.
I didn't. I think I like I said, I think I probably was doing basic dialogue tree writing. That's what I kind of remember. But it was, I don't think it was wandering around the room, clicking object. I may have done some object dialogue, but it wasn't anything significant. And it was kind of like in this little box of, it was definitely in a little box of, oh, we don't have anybody to do this right now. Could you please hook this all up? And so I hooked it all up, wrote some temporary dialogue. It may have been may have turned out to be some final dialogue, but for the life of me, I can't remember at this point.
Sam & Max See the Road also celebrates its 30th anniversary in November. It's been 30 years since 1993. What can I say?
Yay.
What are your recollections from the creation of this game?
Oh, I got any number of them. So the whole thing started, Sean Clark and I were briefly attached to a Loom sequel.
Forge?
We weren't going to be we were going to be on Forge. And it was going to be run by Jenny Sward. And for some reason, and so we worked with her for a couple or a few weeks on, here's some ideas for this game, here's some ideas for this story, none of which I can recall at this particular juncture. But it all fell through. She went to a pitch meeting, and it didn't take. That's my recollection. It didn't take, and Sean and I were wondering, well, what are we going to be doing next? And then Kelly Flock took us into his office and said, yeah, actually took us out to lunch and said, yeah, I want you guys to go do a Sam and Max game. That was pretty much how it got kicked off. We sat down with Steve and worked out a rough idea for the basic concept. I think Steve probably was the guy who had come to us with the Bigfoot and the giraffe neck girl and Conroy Bumpus. He'd kind of had those in his back pocket. And we, put together one of those infamous 5-page pitches for the whole thing. And we included the idea of doing, in the middle of it, I think we definitely mentioned, icon-based dialogue. But aside from that, I was like, oh, okay, it's a Scum game. It's a Scum game with icon-based dialogue featuring Sam and Max, and it seems to have a story that has a beginning, middle, and end. Go forth and do that thing. And so we got started on it, and we got Peter Chan very quickly. He was doing all our background art, this beautiful, gorgeous background art. And that, it just kept moving and moving and moving. Again, it had the issue early, late in the day of we got to wrap this thing. It ran long, but not too long. Sean was pretty good about maintaining some kind of a schedule. Steve blessed us with like the entire opening dialogue, for that opening is all him, and you can tell. And going into the office, there's still that first office cutscene, I think, is pretty much all Steve. And then he would just give, writer's notes for everything else and help out with dialogue all along the line. There were occasional frictions in the design group. Whenever we had something that just never quite worked. You can tell. I bet you if you think real hard, you can figure out which parts we had design issues with. There's all of the puzzles in Bumpusville were like pulling teeth. They never quite felt properly thematic. And in the end, we just did a whole bunch of weird stuff, some of which didn't quite work. But the whole first act and third act are solid, and they let us go completely crazy with the mini games that were pointless. It's hard to even imagine a game, not too many games, small games like that have pointless mini games in them now, which is basically an excuse for Sean and I to like see what we could do screwing around with the Scum engine. Much less, making art for those. But it all just kept moving forward, and even the stressy parts were fun in the end. We had this beautiful music. My God, the music in that game. The McConnell Land, Bajakian, Hydra put together this just beautiful music that I still like to listen to this day. It was, we did almost break a programmer. That was good. I totally forgotten her name. We were all working long hours, and Sean and I shared an office with this new programmer, and she broke down crying in the middle on a Saturday and revealed that she had like carpal tunnel syndrome. She had like developed carpal tunnel on the project and didn't want to tell us at the time. It's like, dude, you have to tell us these things. Yes. She got better, but it's one of the worst stories about the project.
Yeah.
But in the middle, Steve and Colette got married. Steve Purcell and Colette Michaud got married in the middle. We got to go to their wedding. Sam and Max were on the wedding cake as the toppers. What else happened during that? Yeah, it was even with the stresses of the project, it was one of the better projects I ever worked on. we got to tell jokes for months and months on end.
And you got away with a lot of raunchy humor in this game. Wasn't very typical in LucasArts games to see
it wasn't
cats
that
turned
raunchy.
inside out.
That's it. That's just a cat getting turned inside. It wasn't totally. She just went in and got something. The raunchiest thing in that entire thing is in the manual, actually, because Steve in the manual grabbed lots of little bits from his comics and just sort of put them in the margins. And one of them was a bit that he had, which was Sam saying, "Me and my furry little friend love such, and so does Max," which is that's a great dirty joke. But no, we didn't do all that much was raunchy. There were probably some of, I can't think of any off the top of my head. There were very few female characters in Hit the Road. Was not a particularly good representation. Probably just as well considering how we wrote women back then. But I don't think there was any particularly sleazy behavior. Even then, we were kind of hip to not being terrible jerks. This would change. But we got away with a lot of adolescent humor, I think. And then since a little bit of, but even, not bloody violence, just sort of cartoon violence, classic Bugs Bunny type stuff, really. Bullets making giant holes in the wall kind of humor. And, we had one guy who swore a lot, but he was bleeped out. We did horribly abuse Conroy Bumpus in the end, but it's all good-natured fun stuff. We'd get a little more pointed later, I think, by the time Escape ran around, when perhaps Sean and I were getting a little more cynical about things.
The limited run Sam and Max Hit the Road Collector's Edition was announced earlier this year. Now, unlike the other LucasArts Collector's Edition by Limited Run Games, it seems that this one got extra attention and got some really cool collector's items. Did you take part in the production of this Collector's Edition?
I did not play a single whit or jot or tittle of a part in this. No one reached out to me, and why would they? I can't create fresh art. I can't, go off and make models. It would have been interesting to do a CD commentary, but those are always kind of goofy. It's basically a bunch of guys sitting around going, "Yeah, I wrote that joke," while they're drinking a beer. So it's no, I'm happy that somewhere someone is still making money off of it.
I know that in those days, like you said, at LucasArts, they were quite generous with giving credits, even if someone's contribution didn't have a big impact on the project itself. So, for instance, Hal Barwood was credited with "thought it was a good idea" in Full Throttle. But you scored big with your credit in the game, which was led other projects. So I'm curious, what other projects were you working on back then, and why did they decide to credit you with that title?
In Full Throttle?
Yeah.
Well, there was a bizarre thing that tended to happen back then, which was all of the project leads. So me and Sean and Hal and and Ron and Dave and Tim and Noah and all those, we all tended to get some kind of a credit in everybody's game. even if they hadn't done any work, it was kind of like an acknowledgement that there's a brain trust here and we're all kind of tossing ideas around together. Tim, being Tim, decided to make those funny versions of the credits rather than some, version of special thanks or things like that. I think Tim was probably, in my case, knowing Tim Stark, he's probably, and Mike, he stayed away from this project. Good for him. Thanks. So, I think back by then, as soon as Sam and Max ended, I probably hopped on to Afterlife reasonably quickly after that. That's my thinking. Yeah. Which, so, leading other projects, that's probably what I was leading at the time.
The Dig also came out the same year as Full Throttle. Now, as you are well aware, it had 4 different iterations, with the final one being the actual shipped game. Now, I know you're not credited on any of the versions of The Dig, but during your time at LucasArts, The Dig has been in the background in the first 5 years. So you must have seen it being worked on or heard any water cooler discussions about the game and its rocky development process.
I was always aware that it was going on. The thing that always struck me as odd about it, and I would say this about other projects down the road, was this sort of weird impulse that tended to come from someplace to not use the engine we already had. And it would show up repeatedly at LucasArts and occasionally in other companies to kind of say, for some reason, to reject the fact that we had a totally functioning adventure game engine and try to go and build another one. It's like, no, we've got this, and it can be, we've already seen Loom. It can be tortured to do a whole lot of interesting things. As long as we're still making 2D adventure games, why are you trying to reinvent, a pretty functional wheel here? So that was part of it. There was a sense that the Dig was always dragging because they were trying to pull an engine together and other stuff, which I can't even remember. I do remember being kind of relieved when Sean took it over and immediately said, "No, we're using Scum. What's the matter with you?" So we're making a Scum game. Let's go build that now. And then, slowly worked it all together. Got the story and design locked down and put out a pretty darn good game.
Same year, Rebel Assault 2 also came out. And Rebel Assault 2 stands out as one of my top Star Wars games. I was absolutely amazed to learn that they actually brought out the Darth Vader costume from the LucasArts archive, from the Lucasfilm archive, to film new live-action scenes for the game. That was mind-blowing. Now, I understand that you were involved in creating the original concept for the game. Can you share with us when you introduced it to the team and how much of your original concept made its way into the final version of the game?
Of Rebel Assault or Rebel Assault 2?
Rebel Assault 2, you're credited for original concept.
I probably may have helped Vince Lee out with some of the story design, but the only thing I did contribute one absolutely goofy thing to Rebel Assault 2, the hidden text track for the cutscenes. Do you know about that?
Mm-hmm.
The comedy track? No, that's all me and Vince and Brad just hanging out one night, and we must have been drunk and getting, really into stupid jokes and just saying, what would be funny for them to be talking about in these X-Wings? As far as the concept goes, I mean, I'm quite sure I may have helped Vince out with some of the story stuff, but, at the time, the engineering was all above me, above my head and out of my pay grade. So as much as I would hesitate to take any credit away from him on that, I was probably, like Vince was probably being generous on the help I gave him initially, but then he just kind of went to town with it. But I was sharing my office with him a lot back then, because we were running the Afterlife project in the same room. So I probably gave him some help, but not too much. Dialogue. I may have helped with the dialogue. Now that I think about it, there may have been some script editing in there. I can imagine that.
Afterlife is well known for being LucasArts' first attempt at making sim games. How did you come up with the idea for the game? And also, how did you manage to convince the LucasArts execs, who had just regained the rights to make Star Wars games, to create a completely new IP in a genre that they hadn't explored before?
Well, the convincing wasn't that hard, because I think during my years there, at least the early years, there was probably a deep-seated fear of letting me touch Star Wars, because they probably
But you wrote the original
concept
concept on Rebel Assault 2.
Yeah, but I was mostly script doctoring at that point. It's less, and but there probably was a deep-seated fear that I would do something wacky and strange with Star Wars back then. So keeping me away from it wasn't that hard. Convincing them to do it, like I said back then, a good pitch with a solid understanding of the game style you're doing, it could go a long way. And I'd finished a Sam and Max game, so okay, let's give this a shot. To their credit, they went out and went for it. I was at the time extremely interested in sim games, and the fact that if you play Afterlife, you can see that, in about 70% of the game is just a nice reskinning of SimCity 3. Is it 3 or 2? One of the two. It's, oh yeah, that's probably it. Yeah. I devoured articles about how the math worked in that game, and said, okay, I can do this. And so we did. We did write it in C, which was a mistake, but that was, the C++, that should be a C++ game. But that was interesting. We did scope down the game considerably. Originally, every single tile type was going to have one of those gorgeous 300 by 200 pieces of art, and they said, no, we're not going to paint 200 of those just for your silly Will Wright knockoff game. But we got most of what we wanted, and again, some ridiculously gorgeous music, which was, I still listen to today. And, some great yeoman-like coding from Ray Castro and Pat McCarthy and others. And Justin Graham, as our lead programmer. That was a great deal of fun for a project that had probably, in another company, had no business being made. Oh, and the other place it came from, obviously, was, like someone only a few years removed from college, being way too obsessed with Dante's Inferno.
After Afterlife, you and the core team from that project started working on another sim game called TV Wasteland. What can you tell us about that project, and why was it cancelled?
That project was it's pretty simple notion. The running a TV studio, and we were gonna. It was basically another sim game. I killed that because the whole network television thing was starting to fly apart, and I didn't have a good handle on, how we were going to present it visually. It lacked, it just didn't feel like it was coming together. So I nuked it in favor of the Justice Unlimited thing. In hindsight, that might have been an error. Because Justice Unlimited was, it might have been, TV Wasteland might have been a great game, or at least it would have been a smaller scope game that probably could have been gotten pulled off. Justice Unlimited kept fishtailing out from under us, and we never kind of got a handle on it. So we spent a lot of money and didn't build anything, which is sad. And it probably, I immediately after the Justice Unlimited experience went on a 2-month vacation because I had 2 months of vacation time because I never took vacations, trying to get my head straight driving around the country.
So Justice Unlimited is a Diablo-like game, and you worked on it for a whole year before it was canceled. Why was it canceled?
It was canceled because the engine we were building was out of date, and everything was moving to 3D, and we didn't, and it just wasn't coming together. Not for lack of trying. We had good engineers. We had great art that was getting churned out. Wonderful character concepts. I've still got the art Bible around here some places. It's just amazing. But it was just wrong. It was just not going to come together. We didn't have the horses to finish it, and so we pulled the plug. So it was a good plug to pull because it was just going to bleed money in the end. We had great level design ideas. So, we had solid underpinning for its story and its mythology, and we'd worked out the meta game, but it just wasn't coming together.
I presume that you were a fan of the Monkey Island series when you started working on Escape from Monkey Island, having already worked on the first one and probably played the other two. And you also got special thanks in the credits of Curse.
Yeah, probably for the same thing. All project leaders getting thanks.
So, given the fact that you're well acquainted with the Monkey Island universe, why tamper with the continuity in Escape? I mean, things like Guybrush not liking sushi. When in Monkey Island 2, he was willing to eat raw fish as part of his bet with a fisherman. Or Herman Toothrod being revealed as Elaine's grandfather.
But that's just an absurd thing. I'm not even sure why we did that.
Were you aware of the continuity issues, or did you simply decide on these plot points without giving too much thought to the previous games?
There was a little bit. The sushi thing was sort of like more of a Guybrush contains multitudes kind of thing, more than an outright choice. The Herman Toothrot thing, we kind of went, well, there's nothing that says he's not really. Maybe. I mean, whatever issues, Escape has, mostly, there were moments where we needed a couple of people to tell us stop. And, the monkey combat thing being, of course, the most notorious thing. That we should have been told to stop and been sent back to the drawing board for it. We bizarre, and this is more my fault than Sean's. We got too interested in the notion that, the insult sword fighting really does have it's got a core mechanic. What if we just made the core mechanic the thing rather than the actual humor? And we kind of lost our way there. But, there are things that are, I had some, going over it again a while back, what always amazes me is, man, Escape's a huge freaking game. There's like
Yeah.
I'd completely forgotten an entire side island with Edie McClurg on it. I had completely forgotten about the whole bit with the parrots and so forth. And it's like, and there's some really good puzzles in there. That whole Mists of Time thing, which I freely ripped off from Sorcerers Get All the Girls too. The whole notion of having to reenact time backwards correctly, or else you screw up the time is a solid puzzle.
That was awesome.
Whenever people say all puzzle games are all pointy clicky searches, I point them to that thing. But we made some choices along the way, and I'd be the first to admit, I think we had one tester almost confront us at one point. It's like I think Sean and I were starting to get a little fried by the time that sucker wrapped. And we could also see the writing on the wall as far as where the company was going to go from now on. I mean, even though Sean desperately tried to get Full Throttle 2 out the door, it was just always going to be, the classic adventure games were coming to an end at LucasArts. So we were going to have to be doing other things. And combine that with other things that occasionally went on in the company, it was starting to get a little crispy. And so perhaps we weren't at our best at times.
Now, you said that it was a huge game. It was, that the current world record of speedrunning Escape is currently held by Casey Adventure, and he did it in 49 minutes and 2 seconds.
Why would you speedrun an adventure game? That's my answer. It's like, why would you...
Speedrunning an adventure game is a national sport at the moment. I speedrunning Phantasmagoria. The current world record is 5 minutes and change. So
it seems like, I understand the speedrunning of a Mario, where it's like, there's not that much lingering about, lingering about in the world that's completely necessary. But if you're cutting out the jokes and the dialogue, man, it's like, and it was always one of those things, we knew we had to put shortcuts, be able to shortcut our cutscenes, but every time we would just sit there, every time we do that and put the code in for the shortcutting, we'd go, do we really have to? I mean, they're only going to see this once. Why should we let them skip the story points? And it's like, but no, we have to. People might be playing it again, whatever. I think I did work on one game where we did insist that the first time through, you always had to watch it. And then you could skip it afterwards. Maybe even we made that part of the system after a while. But that's interesting. It still takes you 49 minutes to get through Escape, even speedrunning it.
Like I said, he did it in 49 minutes and 2 seconds. Now, the interesting part about speedrunning adventure games is the fact that you start to learn which actions in the game are completely useless. Because usually when you play an adventure game, you keep exploring, and sometimes there are events that are triggered by a conversation or something that you did in a whole nother place. Now, speedrunning games helps you realize which of these things triggers it, so that you'll be able to optimize your speedrun by doing these things whenever you're in the vicinity of that location or when you're already talking to that person. So it's a pretty interesting... Yeah. I understand that in terms of, you're not speedrunning a game in your first playthrough of the game. You're speedrunning it when you played it for the 100th time.
Fair enough. But yeah, that's one thing that is, a contrast of some of the better written, better designed adventure games than the others is the ones that don't gratuitously make you go back and forth across large bits of land. In Max, we kind of did it ironically because, in theory, we're traveling all the way across the country to pick up a toothpick. But, we tried as the years wore on to make it so that, you're not going to leave this first place without hopefully getting everything you need, and we'll try to help you with that. And by the time we were doing it at Telltale, of course, and we were, practically begging people, no, stick around and don't leave here, get all your stuff, and we'll make sure that you've got everything you need to go forward. As opposed to some companies that would allow you to leave and get stuck, but I won't mention them by name.
Something online.
Yeah, something online. You do know that about Fate of Atlantis ending, right?
I do know about Fate of Atlantis what?
The ending of Fate of Atlantis with the Neurobsal ghost that comes out at the end. Bill Eakin animated that. It's mouthing F Sierra.
Really?
Yes.
That's
and
awesome.
It's great because it actually matches. It matches the little beat of music too. Bum ba bum bum. Yeah. Yes.
Wow.
So now you know that.
Now I know
we
that.
We were
occasionally
very petty. Yes.
Well, you were petty for a good reason, because Sierra were more popular at the time, at least in the US, even though they had dead ends in their games and you could die by exploring a location or by just, I don't know, looking at items in your inventory could have killed you by that point.
Yeah, it's true. But they also, they had great writing and they had gorgeous art. So, they were, as they say, worthy. They were worthy corporate competitors.
Yeah, but you guys had Mark Ferrari and Bill Tiller, so.
Yeah, well, no, we had spectacular artists of our own. Yes, that's for sure. Peter Chan.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Now, you've mentioned in the past that one of the reasons why LucasArts switched to 3D in the adventure game genre is because it was cheaper. Can you throw a few numbers to help us understand the differences in budget? How much did Curse cost, and how much did Escape cost?
Well, that's the problem. Is I think they were probably comparable in the end, because we were trying again. We ended up building an engine for Escape. We put it all in Lua. Mm-hmm. We were trying to figure out how to do 3D, and it wasn't really true 3D. It was 2.5D. It was like 3D characters in a pre-rendered world, so we could reshoot the world and make a different shot and have the 3D characters rocking around in them. Curse was expensive because, they took this, rocket leap forward in their 2D artwork and made it very much like an animated cartoon, which was a lot more expensive than the sort of, pixel animation back in the day. I have no sense. I mean, nowadays, of course, it is a lot cheaper in some ways. It's, hey, I got a 3D model, I got a 3D world, I can spin the cameras everywhere, I can do whatever the heck I want. It was probably not cheaper initially. But the thinking was we can't continue to do these, increasingly beautiful 2D animations, bespoke 2D animations, because, we'll suddenly find ourselves as a ersatz Disney studio, and that's not good. So, we hopped onto the 3D bandwagon with, some success. The Guybrush, the look of the characters kind of got back and forth. We didn't know what we were doing. Some of us didn't know what we were doing with lighting and shading as much. We got better at it, but it was bumpy.
In Escape, Elaine has an American accent for the first and only time in the series. Why didn't you use the original voice actress for Elaine in this game?
I have, I go back and I can't even remember why we made that decision. Beats the living daylights out of me, man. In hindsight, it makes not much sense. I can't remember whether it was, I can't remember the actual casting. I nope, I honestly can't. Very strange, actually, in hindsight. We weren't intentionally throwing her out the window. Almost, no, I could not tell you. Can't be availability. Voice actors are always available. So I'm not sure what was going on there.
Let's talk about the limitations of Grime. Grime is the 3D engine which was used for running the game, and it was also used for Grim Fandango. Now, the engine was very limited in terms of polygons that could be presented in each scene. And this is the reason why there couldn't be more than 3 characters in addition to Guybrush in each scene, which is why the islands are so empty.
So, exactly. Yep, that is, in fact, it was a huge limitation. And even though the computers were getting faster, it was, and that's, we would occasionally, figure out good cheats for having half characters, that we could, drop in and barely animate. But, it made Melee much emptier than it needed to be. It made trying to do certain cutscenes, extremely tricky. And having to do really funky things with camera angles. It was, it was a bit of a hassle.
Now, one of my questions was whether or not in the scene, because since, like I mentioned, you couldn't have Guybrush with more than 3 characters on screen, but there's one scene in which you have Guybrush and the judges and the other swimmer all in one scene. So my question is, are the judges' lower half of the body non-existent?
Most likely, yes. And it's, and it's not entirely, the judges are probably half characters. And it's not, a hard limit on 3 characters. I mean, if you got a low enough poly count or a simple enough skeleton, you can do other things. You can work it. But it was mostly why do we have 3 judges? Oh, I know why we had 3 judges for that puzzle. Okay. But mostly it was a hard count. And, we ended up, we had that classroom scene that's got 4, maybe 5 people in it. And so I think, I can't remember whether we had 5, maybe 4. Seems like we should have 5 in there. But again, half bodies will do, go a long way for you. If you don't have to do legs, you're in good shape.
From a creative point of view, did you find the use of 3D allowed you to be more creative, or did you mainly feel the technical limitations limiting you? Even in terms of story?
I felt the technical limitations were, if I had my druthers, and I was completely unable to have my druthers back then, I would have gone for more. I would have preferred a 2D approach. It is, the number, because, even though we had the ability to, do different camera angles on the same sets, we only used that sparingly, notably in the opening scene. The opening scene, a couple of the scene, the LeChuck transformation scene, and a few others. We would, occasionally go through the effort of relighting, rebaking a scene from a different angle so that we could put it into the cutscene. But, we didn't have true 3D. Then, we couldn't swing the cameras around and do anything really interesting. So I don't think we bought as much as we thought we were going to buy with that. And, the limitations, are pretty marked. They're easy to see. But, that is one of the issues of, technology and transition. You occasionally get these artifacts of an age that, that must have been in the era when they couldn't do full 3D yet, but everybody was doing 3D models. Yep, that's what it is. Fandango lucked out into having its own thing right there. It's singular. It never was 2D. It would never be fully 3D. So it's like, yes, this fits the time perfectly. Whereas Escape sits, in this interregnum between the best 2D ever and now, now here's a fully 3D Monkey Island, 8 or whatever years later.
And the other thing that Grim Fandango had going for it was the fact that the characters had very low poly count, given that they were very basic skeletons, while Guybrush's haircut probably had most polygons in each scene.
Guybrush's haircut, we did some tricks with that, but no, his face alone was, it's, to get close to being, something that looks like Guybrush was, just a pain in the tuchus. But it's, I still prefer him to the, I still prefer the Escapes Guybrush to the whatever the heck's going on with his hair in that the version that LucasArts put out, the remastered version. It's like, I got called in to show that off. They were showing that off while we were doing Tales, and it's like, I made the mistake of asking, you're gonna fix the hair, right? just like was this. It's like, no, what's wrong with that? Someone made a very strange art decision that day.
Now, from what I understand, the lack of mouse support in Grim Fandango was more of an artistic choice made by Tim of not having anything on screen apart from the game itself. Not even a mouse cursor. So when it came to Escape, did you consider adding mouse support? Or did you use Grim Fandango's controls as is to simplify the development process?
The latter, definitely. We could have, and then by the time, we were doing something else by then. By the time Freelance Police rolled around, we kind of came back to our senses and said, no, we're making a point-and-click adventure game. Let's make it so that you can point and click. It would have worked with either, and in hindsight, we should have gone with point and click, I think.
Eventually Team added point and click support to the remastered version.
Yeah, if one ever came out, which I doubt there will be, I probably would have done that.
In terms of game preservation, it seems that the period between the late 90s and the early 2000s is kind of the dark ages of gaming, as each game used some outdated Windows-based technology that was problematic to run on modern Windows machines. Escape, unfortunately, suffered the same fate, and until earlier this year, it's been a mess to run it on modern machines. And then Aaron Giles, who's an emulation genius and a former LucasArts employee, had created Dream, which is a LucasArts emulator that's able to run many of the LucasArts classic games on modern machines.
Yeah.
And after so many, many years, I was finally able to play Escape without any issues from beginning to end. For the first time in decades. I think the last time I played it was 2005 or 2006, and now I've played it like a couple of months ago. Great game.
That's great. It's a modern LucasArts miracle. Well, that's good to hear. I'm glad some people are playing it again. That's nice. I think I finally am comfortable with the amount of penance I've done for Monkey Combat, because I think by owning up to it for about 15 years or so, I think people have finally forgiven me. Hopefully.
But speaking of owning up to it, on LinkedIn, you list Escape from Monkey Island as one of the projects you've worked on. After which you wrote, "Sorry about Monkey Combat." What was the deal with monkey combat, and was it always the plan to have it be such a prominent part of the third act?
It got, Escape from Monkey Island had huge third act problems in general. We had an end. We knew we wanted to get to the end. We actually had the whole puzzle set out for the final bit, which is actually kind of clever. The playing to a tie. That's a good puzzle for the end. But we had a lot of the mucking about on Monkey Island. We didn't have fully designed before we started building, which was an error, I think. We had some broad strokes, and then we had some things that never worked, and we kept going back, and so a lot of the puzzles fell apart, and then Monkey Island and then Monkey Combat just kind of filled in a lot of blanks, unfortunately. And we, like I said, we thought it was funnier than it was, or I thought it was funnier than it was, and it needed to be, there needed to be less of it, and it needed to be stripped down and redesigned, in toto. We got way too into shouting monkey combat at the top of our lungs, like that was inherently funny. So, you live and you learn. It's, I have back in the day, I was probably less prone to taking design advice randomly. And nowadays I've properly had my ego shattered and rebuilt a few times, so that, I'm much more, I don't know if humble, but a lot more open to ideas from wherever they come from. So, yeah.
Since Escape came out on the PC as well as the PlayStation 2, I always ask the LucasArts legends I'm interviewing what they think the definitive version of their game is. So which of these versions, the PC or the PlayStation 2, is the definitive version, in your opinion?
I think you should play the PC version only because the PlayStation version has long load times, is my recollection. There is definitely... it was a perfectly good port, but there is definitely some round hole, square peg kind of motions to get it crammed into it. So, no content, no significant content had to be cut, but, there are things that didn't get onto the PlayStation disc, I don't think. And it's just a little more annoying to play with the little joystick than it is to even steering around with the keyboard is a little better, I think.
As you mentioned, Monkey Island 1 and 2 were remastered back in 2009. So if you had the option to remaster Escape, what would you have done? You already mentioned that it would probably be 2D and it probably have point-and-click functionality. But would you have changed anything in the game, or would you just recreate it in 2D?
Well, if you could recreate it in 2D, that would be spectacular. That would take a whole lot of money, though. But beyond that, if I had a chance, I would actually see if I could strip down Monkey Combat into something more palatable, more interesting. I'm not sure what it would be. I'd have to spend a good 2 hours in a cave thinking about it. But I could come up with something. So, and then in I think in deference to Ron's return ending, I would leave all the weird little continuity hiccups in there, just so that, because after all, in the end, the stories get to range all over the place. I think that would be just fine.
I think you should leave all the continuity issues in the game. This way, it will show all the glitches in the Matrix and have people wondering whether or not this entire thing is real. And then, by the time you get to return, then you realize it's not, and then it makes
and none of
escape.
it's real. No, I think, and that's fine. Yeah, and the whole, it's really interesting because by the time Tales rolls around, by the end of Tales, we've also completely blown up all the, most of the relationships. Is the voodoo ladies manipulating you all along in some kind of weird cosmic battle with LeChuck? What the heck? It's interesting that, how much or little that gets picked up on in the final analysis as well.
Now, usually Monkey Island games have timeless humor, but in Escape, I felt that a lot of the humor was based around pop culture references from the late 90s and early 2000s, like referencing Britney Spears with Britney the bank teller deciding to switch careers and start singing, and Mortal Kombat and Monkey Combat. And of course, the anti-commercialization commentary throughout the game.
There is a lot of that. Well, I mean, in really interesting hindsight, basically we were doing what that Matrix movie did a few years ago, is basically
a year before,
commenting on the absurdity of doing another Monkey Island game by commercializing the heck out of all of the Monkey Island stuff in the middle of the game. We were probably... It was a little pop culture heavy. But, that kind of comes and goes in Monkey Island a little bit. We pulled back on it a little further, and we pulled back on it considerably for Tales, I think. And I think that's genuinely the way you should be going. We did try to steer into it because we were pushing the whole, anti-commercialization and all the, the gentrification of Melee Island and so forth. And that one, Planet Guybrush, Planet Threepwood shop. I'm not sure where that all came from us. I mean, it is weird that we decided, because Sean and I were all gung-ho, let's do another Monkey Island game. But it is an interesting, there may have been some subconscious things that were going on there as we were writing up this design. To say, we are starting to milk this cow a little bit, and maybe perhaps we shouldn't be. Then, of course, I went and tried to do another Sam & Max game, so what do I know?
Now, since you denied the fact that you worked on Rebel Assault 2, then let's talk about the first Star Wars game you actually worked on, which was Jedi Knight 2, Jedi Outcast.
Yep.
As the scriptwriter on Jedi Outcast, what part did you play in the development process?
For Jedi Knight 2, the story was already in place. So aside from occasional, because the story basically went with the levels. So there wasn't much free-form design of the storyline at that point. Basically, I was brought in to be the scriptwriter on that. And I was, basically writing all the cutscenes, not quite as much as the incidentals, but there weren't that many incidentals back then. So I was writing the cutscenes from stem to stern, taking editing notes and trimming them down. And I did much the same thing with Outcast a couple of years later. Although there I probably participated a little bit more in the story stuff from the beginning, since I was brought on early. And that's how that all went. That was fun. That was, by then I was starting to, I was getting real close to the point where I'm probably not going to, I was wondering whether I was going to be running another game. And so I was being comfortable being a sort of house writer for stuff. I was happy to be given a chance to do Star Wars seriously. And I toned it down. They did cut out my bit about, I was initially trying to figure out how in the heck Kyle Katarn hadn't used the Force for several years. And I initially came up with this ridiculous idea that he chewed a lot of bantha jerky, and bantha jerky suppresses Force powers. They did not go for that idea. That would have been a great addition to the Star Wars canon, though.
Indeed. Maybe that's the reason why they didn't allow you to work on Star Wars games before this one.
No, because I would suggest things like that. Yes. Yeah. But I did eventually get to do comedy stuff in Star Wars, but it would be a few years later when we were doing Battlefront or Battlegrounds. I always get them wrong. Battlefront 2.
Battlefront.
Right? 2, yes. I always get Battlegrounds and Battlefront mixed up in my head. Battlefront 2, I got to do a lot more comedy Star Wars in the interstitials, which you can find because someone went and played them long enough to hear them all. But we had one of my favorite things to do, and I always encourage programmers to do this for games like that, is make it so that you have lines that only get read like 1 out of 10,000 times this situation occurs, so that people like wonder if they actually really heard them and they can't make them happen again for months. So that's what we did with Battlefront 2. We had just these lines like, look out, it's Jango Fett and he's brought his head, and I can't shake him. Wait, I can shake him. He's remarkably easy to shake, and things like that. Just really stupid Star Wars lines. That's Darth Maul. What's he gonna do? Bleed all over us? And such. But they only play rarely, so you have to go online and find recordings of them all.
And when you go online and post about these things, people are certain that you're lying because they can't reproduce these lines in the game.
Yeah. Yep. But they're there. I've seen YouTube videos. What people actually do is they go strip out the files, which is not fun. They strip out the voice files and find them. That's not cool. Let's see. Yeah, so I did that. I did Outcast. And was the next thing Sam and Max Freelance Police?
But before that, let's stick around with Jedi Outcast a bit longer. As a Star Wars fan, what was it like to write dialogue for such an iconic character as Lando Calrissian, who is voiced by Billy D. Williams himself in the game?
It's weird. I think back then, especially for the Star, even though I was doing stuff in the studio with Sam and Max and the Monkey Island characters, I was not put in the studio with the Star Wars characters. So it's cool to write dialogue for those characters in an abstract kind of way and hear it later. But at the time, you're just going, okay, how am I going to make this line shorter? Okay, I can kind of hear it there. No, there's a Lando Calrissian voice. I kind of hear it. Okay. And Luke. Yeah. Is he being overly serious? Yes. Okay. That's great. That's perfect. I got Luke down. It really is interesting. I so much loved in hindsight, it took me a while, but I really warmed to Last Jedi and Hamill's Luke Skywalker in that. Old, bitter, snarky Luke Skywalker is great. I wish and there was no reason he should be that younger. So, so you had to write him kind of deathly serious, also, especially in the sort of post, Return of the Jedi era, when he's, burdened by, I've got to restart the Jedi Order and, live up to Yoda and Obi-Wan. And so, he's a bit of a stick in the mud compared to, Kyle Katarn and Kyle's partner. But it is fun to write for those characters, but you don't feel it quite as much because it feels like, it's a task at that point. I got to get through these cutscenes. I got to give them just enough oomph. I got to make sure there's a nice killer line near the end to lead into the level. So, it doesn't quite resonate as much as when you then go into the booth with the actors and work them through your dialogue. as I would be doing a lot more at Telltale.
In Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb, you served as a story and dialogue consultant. Could you provide more details about your contributions to the story?
That is much more of, me, I think I ate, like I said, I think I ate, more than 1,000 lunches with Al, while I was at LucasArts. And so, that has much more to do with me just kind of, me and him kicking around ideas back and forth, while he was working through his story. I couldn't tell you any details that I might have added. I'm sure I probably helped with one or two of them. But that was, everybody had Indiana Jones ideas floating around, and Hal was the best at them. And things always kept getting brooded about as, we should do another one. Okay. And this Hal finally got one moving again. We had this Iron Phoenix idea somewhere along the line where they were going to resurrect Hitler, because that's a thing we should, be playing with is Hitler. And the only contribution, I think I was the one who contributed the title to that. It's like, we're talking about something or another. Like, no, it should be Iron Phoenix. Just go with that. That's your Hitler resurrection.
That's an awesome title.
Yeah, and I kept trying to kick up this ridiculous Horn of Gabriel thing that was gonna, I really was interested in having a story that used all four at the time Indiana Jones incarnations. Was going to use annoying preteen Indy, River Phoenix era teen Indy from the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, regular Indy, and was just going to end on ancient eye patch Indy, like knocking something over in 2001, and that would be the final, that would be the final step in the story, and that never got anywhere. But no, Hal and I probably had little story jam sessions as he was working things out, like all of us did.
Well, they ignored his ideas. Maybe they ignored yours as well.
Yeah, maybe.
In an article from 2005, you said that Sam & Max Freelance Police was the smoothest project you've ever worked on. What can you tell us about the production of Freelance Police and about the project as a whole?
I could tell you a lot of things.
I'm here to listen.
We made there were a couple things that went on with Freelance Police. First of all, I got asked to do another one, which was great. We were going to use the same Lua scripting engine that we'd used, by and large, for Escape, and that made building rooms, and the basic coding that much smoother. Me and Nick Pavis and Kevin Bruner, made a pact not to go into battle of building the darn thing until the engine was kind of, in place enough to, start assembling assets. And, and Nick and Kevin company put it together pretty quickly. And it worked. And we had, designed most of the, it was going to be an episodic game. It had 5 or 6, I think 6 episodes. It had all these episodes, individual episodes, and I'd written all of the cutscene dialogue and recorded it. And we actually had, with Dan, we had a producer that was keeping track of our progress. And there was no particular design friction. We were all just kind of plowing away at it. That said, as much as the legend would have it that it was almost finished and then they canceled it. No, we were not almost finished. We were a half finished or 60% finished. We had over designed it. There was lots of these little mini games inside of it that, although much more important than the plot than the original Sam & Max game, were proving to be annoying as heck. There was going to be a lot of dialogue that needed to still be recorded for dialogue trees and whatnot and puzzles. But it was not running appreciably behind. It was, probably, it was decent sized budget, but it was not a troubled production in the slightest. It was all bopping along. I'd be the first to admit that dialogue-wise, it had indulged my worst traits because I didn't have someone coming in and really telling me, hey, make this shorter. But it would have been unbridled Stemmle dialogue, which occasionally is a bit wordy. But it was all there. It was happening. The first or the second episode, it must have been the first episode. The first episode had a very what turned out to be what's the car soccer game again? I always forget its name. Rocket League. The first episode essentially had a prototype for Rocket League in it, which tells you how big the stupid mini games were, right? It's like, yeah, no problem. We'll just have cars running around and knocking balls around into a giant thing. No problem. It'll be easy. Yeah. So that gives you some sense of the things and some of the ambitions there. But, Steve and I were getting along great because Steve by that point was over at Pixar, so he wasn't, full. He was basically just sort of giving his benediction to the the story and the dialogue, whatever he wanted to. It was all working pretty well until suddenly it was, nope, we're done. And that's all she wrote.
A couple of years ago, Graham Animal shared storyboards of his work on Sam & Max Freelance Police, which included Hoagie and Bernard from Day of the Tentacle as part of a snowball throwing minigame. Whose idea was it to add them, and what other Easter eggs were present in the game?
The little Hoagie and little Bernard, I'm not sure where the impetus came for that. We knew we were going to have this little snowball fighting mini puzzle, which I can't even remember how it worked. Again, probably a little too ambitious. In the middle of this episode that took place at a snow festival with a crazed snow queen. Who voiced her? I can't remember. But, we just kind of said, well, we got two kids. Why don't we make them Bernard and Hoagie? And we just sort of went with that. I don't think we had too many. I think those may have been the only callbacks to other games we had in there. I don't think we had any Monkey Island references. I don't even think we had any Star Wars jokes, which is kind of amazing because I think we had an episode in space. We did have an episode in space, but we didn't have any Star Wars jokes. Aside from a naked character that in the Burning Max who looked a lot like me, we weren't doing that much in terms of inside jokes.
Now, like you said, there were supposed to be a lot of mini games. I think about 19 mini games, if I remember correctly. Were you fond of the mini games in 7 Max Hit the Road that you decided to add so many in Freelance Police, or did you think that action sequences were a must to keep players engaged back then?
Well, it was a little weirder than that, because we were thinking now about episodic, and we were thinking about replay value, and we were thinking that we should have, if they make these mini games actually scoreable. It wasn't just that you had a snowball fight game. It was a snowball fight game that in the end had a score that you could get. And so, you'd have to do something to you'd have to achieve a certain amount of skill to actually move the story forward. But afterward, you'd have this mini game in what we called Gitmo, the genial yet troubling gaming organism. Gitgo. Yeah, the genial yet troubling gaming organism. Basically a handheld gaming device that was alive and squirming in your hand, but would replay the mini games for you at a moment's notice. So you could go play them again, get a better score. Bob's your uncle. You've got replay value. As the Telltale would prove more or less years later, you don't really need that much replay value. So again, probably over-designed a bit, but some of them were really cool. I mean, the Rocket League prototype was pretty good. I had this amazing, God, what's the game with the little plastic pieces that you put in and it explodes after about a minute? Perfection, an amazing 3D perfection thing in space in zero gravity where you had to plug holes in the hull of a ship with different shapes that were scattered all over the place, and you had to do them in time before you blacked out from lack of oxygen. That was going to be great for the replay value. We also had in the space one again, we had a version of the Master Control from Tron that you had to float around and blow up but it was spherical, and the Master Control was a giant nacho chip instead of whatever he was in Tron. So yeah, these are all going to be pretty good games, but they did add to the overall stress of getting the thing programmed. Yeah.
Then LucasArts came out with a press release stating that after careful evaluation of current marketplace realities and underlying economic considerations, we've decided that it wasn't an appropriate time to launch a graphic adventure game on the PC. How soon after they informed you of the cancellation of the project did they release this press statement?
I think it was within a day. Although, again, that's a bit of a blur back then, since I was probably spending most of my time wandering around in a white incoherent rage. It was bizarre. It was, and to this day, I'm not sure how much, it's possible since I wasn't the guy. I had a producer between me and upper management. It's possible I might have been shielded from things that were going on above me until they just sort of dropped the hammer. But yeah, they got that out. They got that out pretty quickly because the decision had already been made, and it wasn't like there was going to be a conversation about it. So there was no reason not to put out that press release because it was going to get out very quickly. The internet at that point was enough of a thing that, somebody was going to say something out loud. And it might have even been me at that point if I had been a tad less professional. As it was, I had to bite my tongue for a long stretch there. Steve was incredibly generous throughout that period since he didn't work for LucasArts, and said very nice and all the right things that could be said at the time.
And how did the team take the news?
They were just as befuddled. I think. I like to think. They were just as befuddled. And, that was pretty much, the writing, again, like I said before, the writing was pretty much on the wall. Okay, we're not doing adventure games anymore. It's, really time to hop onto the Star Wars wagon, which is fine. Star Wars is a great wagon to hop onto if you can. Yeah. And, I don't remember, too many other particulars from the days that followed. Again, I probably took another long vacation at that point because, again, I was building up a lot of time working on these things, and I think a lot of people on the team did too. But yeah, that was. It remains a perplexing and vexing decision, and to this day, I've never gotten a really, solid sense of why it happened like it happened. I made a joke. I've made a consistent joke over the years about being told in the meeting that the entire European adventure game audience had disappeared off the face of the earth. And I said, well, that's a news story. You should cover that because apparently a whole bunch of people just disappeared. And my sarcasm at the time was not appreciated. So, yeah. If I'd been a more, if I'd been a bit more headstrong at that point, I probably would have quit. But the golden handcuffs at LucasArts were actually pretty nice. So as long as they kept giving me work, and after that last jabbing with pointy sticks, stopped jabbing me with pointy sticks, that was okay there for a few more years.
I mean, during the production of 7 Max Freelance Police, they canceled Full Throttle. Like, they canceled it in August 2003, and that was 7 months before they canceled 7 Max Freelance Police. So during that time, were there discussions in the team that might happen to the game, to 7 Max Freelance Police, or did you look at it as if Full Throttle wasn't, the sequel to Full Throttle wasn't a good enough idea to proceed with it, but we're good?
We thought we were good, without, I didn't know the particular ins and outs, but my impression all along was that Full Throttle 2 was a project that kept, hiccuping and didn't quite come together. It was like, oh, should we, because it had a lot to pay off, whereas Sam & Max, frankly, we could have even taken an easier design on Sam & Max and still been running at, full speed, we were, we knew what we wanted to do, and we were out and we were building it. If it's going to be this adventure game, it's going to be point and click, and we're going to have these things over here that are fused into it. It's going to be great. We're going to do these short episodes, so that, worst case scenario, we can start cutting and trimming. We knew what we were building. My impression is that Full Throttle 2 always had this, what are we actually doing here problem. I mean, frankly, Full Throttle 1, this is a nice game. It's this very short adventure game with a couple of interesting little action sequences. By the time it's rolling around in, nearly 2000, in the 2000s, you're going, okay, if we're going to do these action sequences, we got to do them right. And we got to, but are we an adventure game anymore? And I think it got stuck in never quite figuring out whether it was fish or fowl. And so it never quite hung together properly. And, so, our group pretty much said, okay, well, it got canceled. We can kind of see why it got canceled, but that's not really what's, we're on top of what we're doing. And it might be a little ambitious, but we know what we are, and we have an engine, and it's coming along. So it was a lot more surprising for us.
You mentioned the fact that every time the story is being told, there's less and less percentage of the completed game being reported, because I know stories in which it was 80% done. I talked to people who said it was 75% done.
I just want to be honest about it, because, it's easy to mythologize about the tragedy of it. to say, oh, they canceled this nearly completed masterpiece. It's one of the worst tragedies of gaming history. And it's a game that was well on its way to getting finished, but it had work to do. We had done a whole heck of a lot for the first, I guess it's 5 episodes. The first, no, 4 episodes. It was 6 episodes. We'd done a whole heck of a lot of work on the first 4 episodes. Not all that much on the 5th or the 6th yet. I can picture some of the models for the sets for 5 and 6. They're definitely coming together, but we were building them somewhat sequentially. So you could say we were somewhere in that 50, 60, 70% range. I couldn't tell you exactly. But it wasn't like we weren't like suddenly hitting the hard part or anything. We were, we were just chugging through. We were just chugging through the assets and the resources and putting them together and hooking them up. So the train was, heading downhill, as it were.
Did anyone keep a copy of the source code of this game? Will it ever be released?
I have been reliably informed that there are some people who have entire copies of all of the resources for Sam and Max Freelance Police. I would not have any copies because that would mean that I took intellectual property from LucasArts back in the day and saved it for myself.
Okay.
No, but seriously, yeah, there are copies floating around of all of the source. In fact, let's see. What is this? This is the entire cutscene script for Freelance Police. Right there. And as far as it ever coming out, that'd be hard, man. You'd have to rebuild the engine. You'd have to somehow rebuild the engine. You'd have to hire artists to come in and finish all the art and scripters to do all the, Lua scripting. You'd probably have to cut all of the lame jokes that don't work at all anymore. Although I think all the Burning Max jokes probably still land. It could happen someday. If it does, I would like to be involved. There is a whole question of ownership, of course. Among other things, I would assume that Disney in some fashion owns all the intellectual property of these stories and whatnot. So that's an issue. I did actually get to tell the story once in a game. Do you know about that?
Yeah, in Poker Night, right?
Yep, you know that. That's an easy one. Okay. Yeah, Poker Night 2, I tell the a very brief précis of the entire story, which is an absurd story when I think about it, but most of them are.
No, you don't have to release the source code. You can just run it on a computer from 2004 and have screen grabs from the game or video capture and upload it to YouTube. I'm just throwing ideas. I want to see the game.
The art would look so primitive compared to, even the first Sam and Max Telltale season. But stranger things have been known to happen, and people are bored. So
the art may look primitive, but like Hal Barwood told me in my conversation with him, he didn't like the art of Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine when the game came out because it looked outdated by the time it came out. But after a few decades, it's got that nice retro 3D look. So the same goes for Escape, and the same goes for Sam and Max Freelance Police.
that's a nice, generous way to look at it. It also helps that the more you play those old games on faster machines, the newer, faster machines, the less clunky they feel. If everything is flying along as fast as they were always intended to, it helps. It goes a long way to making the forgiving old graphics.
You mentioned that you stuck around LucasArts for another year or so after Freelance Police was canceled. When did you leave LucasArts exactly?
You can probably tell from my last credit. Well,
you've got in 2005, you got the Star Wars games, you got Battlefront, and you got the Knights of the Old Republic and Republic Commando as well.
Republic Commando was the last one I was working on while I was there, and then I was booted right before they moved to the Presidio. Literally about a month before. So figure that time out. Let's see. So I did that. That must have been after Comic-Con that year. Because that's when I met my wife, my future wife. And is that right? No, maybe it was the year before I met Molly. In any event. But yeah, and then I got booted because I then went to, at that point, spent some time in the wilderness doing random odd contracting jobs, and then I went over to Perpetual after that, unfortunately named Perpetual Entertainment because they never released a product. They were just perpetually building. And then I did Battlefront was contract work outside of LucasArts. And I'm not sure why I got a Knights of the Old Republic credit. I think it must have been Coder 2, right?
No, it was Special Thanks.
That was probably just a special designer special thanks. I did do some extra dialogue on Knights of the Old Republic 2, but I don't think any of it actually got in. And Republic Commando is interesting. That was the one I almost drove up to the ranch to have an argument with George Lucas over, because I believed that at the beginning I had a whole arc for the four troopers where they were going to start out with very similar personalities, and because the game took place over several years, by the time you get to the end levels, they would have distinct personalities because they'd been out in the world. But my argument was, wait, these guys are all clones. They've all been raised in the same place with the same stuff. They, in their first contact with the rest of the world, they should all be kind of the same dudes. There's no nature nurture question here because they're all the same nature and they've all been nurtured the same. It's only should be contact with the rest of the world that changes them. But George wanted, no, they should all have their distinct World War II trooper, habits right out the date in Camino. To his credit, that's probably wiser on a purely having fun kind of level, but I was very vexed by that at the time. But it was fun. Wrote a lot of good dialogue for that, and we got to kill the guy, and we got to kill 7 at the end, so that was nice. Which makes no sense, of course. It's like, yes, we're having this game where you're constantly dying and coming back and got save points and so forth, but we're going to kill a guy randomly in a cutscene at the end. It's like, sure, that's just mean.
It makes for interesting storytelling.
But it's kind of, it's a little weird and cheap on a, it'd be one thing if you were, to get to a Telltale thing, if at a later point in the game you were put into near the end of the game, you're put into a no-win situation and one of the 4 of you's got to die. That's just the way the game works. One of the 4 of you's got to go, take the bullet. That's a organic gameplay thing, right? To just do it randomly in a cutscene is like a little cruel and cheesy. But we weren't quite as sophisticated back then, and people love it. So. And then I did Battlefront 2, which, like I said earlier, has all the jokey bits and the interstitials, but it quite by happenstance has like some of my favorite stuff that I've done in a serious vein, because I wrote all those journals of the 501st for Battlefront 2, all those little cutscenes leading into all the battles in the solo thing. And it pleases me no end that all of those, even though they're like questionably canon at this point, all of those still like get randomly quoted throughout the internet when they're talking about the clone troopers. Like, okay, I have done my little teeny tiny bit to contribute to somewhat interesting Star Wars canon, for a contract gig. So it's like, okay, that's cool. I'll run with that. That's, not quite as cool as Sam and Max, but for Star Wars, it's pretty good.
And you show those guys that didn't let you do a Star Wars game back in the 90s.
Well, yeah, I mean, those, yeah, I should have been let. Thing is about Star Wars games is early on they were hard trying to, Darren Stinnett, got into a great thing with just, Dark Forces. We're going to do Doom and we're going to do Star Wars and we're going to make sure it's, actually good. And then, more and more it's sort of, we had X-Wing and TIE Fighter, these spectacular games, and Rebel Assault, which is like, oh, I guess I do need to get a CD-ROM drive. And then it just sort of like, we started running real low pretty quickly after that. It's like, we started doing, we got to do a fighting game and this weird little tile game and, whatever the heck. And then the prequels came along with their interesting storylines, and those did not end up. Pod Racer was pretty good. Give Pod Racer was basically built to be a video game, so yay, we did it, and we did it, did it right, more or less. But it just got harder and harder to make good Star Wars games, and yeah, so there's that.
So when did you first hear that Telltale are working on a new 7 Max game?
Well, I got, it's one of those things I always wonder, should I have jumped to Telltale? And I just didn't feel it at the time. I wasn't, in the mood to be in a startup. I heard somewhere, I guess it must have been while I was over at Perpetual, that they were doing it. And I said, well, that's great. I mean, it helps that, as much as, I'm identified with Sam and Max, they're not technically my creations. So, anybody else doing them, especially since I trusted the people who were, I liked the people who were working on them, is like, great. I'm happy they're doing it. Maybe someday I'll get to do that again. And so it was interesting to see. And, I loved hearing about it. I'm also, forever grateful that Dan and Kevin took me in as Perpetual collapsed and gave, basically hired me sight unseen. Said, oh yeah, we'll bring Mike in and we'll do some games with him. It'd be great. So, I'm always grateful that they did that. No matter how weird Telltale got in its later years, that I wouldn't trade the opportunity I had to work with Sam and Max and Monkey Island and Back to the Future, and all that, and Strong Bad, and they dumped me into the fire with Strong Bad. All that was great. And, I got to spend a lot more time with a lot more interesting actors in the booth during those years. And so that was all wonderful. it's an experience I had to have, and it, gave me closure on a lot of things. It gave me closure on Monkey Island, gave me closure on Sam and Max. Although I just keep ripping that wound open over and over again. Anyway, so it was great. They put together they executed on a good idea they had. And then they executed on an even better idea that some other people in the company had, and they, got Walking Dead out the door, which was the perfect vehicle for that particular brand of interactive storytelling. And it's very hard to replicate, as the years after showed. That's I do not. What's the word? I look back on the start of my Telltale years very fondly.
So you played Sam and Max the first season as a player, not as an active creator.
Yes.
So
that's true.
Given the fact that the original crew, or part of the original crew that worked on Freelance Police, worked on the first season of Sam and Max at Telltale, did you notice any similarities between the games or plot points that were in the original Freelance Police script?
No, they went entirely their own direction on story, which is good because it's not like every Sam and Max story's ever been written. They pretty much and they were working with Steve again to help put their story together. So they had entirely new things they wanted to do, and that was great. I mean, I plead guilty to this. Is there's a danger as you keep bringing a license back to indulge in a little too much retroactive navel gazing rather than doing your own thing, right? And I thought, over the 3 seasons of Sam and Max at Telltale, they did a very good job of okay, what's the entirely new stupid thing we're doing this season? Oh, okay, we're doing this demonic toy chest and so forth and so on. And with very, very light touches of acknowledging what had gone before in previous incarnations. There's a nice bit in the very final episode of season 3 where they've got they're in Max's inventory, and there is stuff from every single version of Sam and Max that every single game version's in there. And when I went off into the VR thing a couple of years back, we hit upon a few jokes hither and yon. Probably leaned into a little bit too much about, hey, we're getting pretty old, aren't we? Jokes, because I'm old now and I do those jokes. And that sort of acknowledgement that they have this ridiculously deep history that we are not going to spend all that much time talking about and will openly contradict if necessary, because it's better to be funny than canon, I think.
You mentioned that you also worked on Tales of Monkey Island at Telltale. Now, as someone who's worked on episodic Monkey Island games as well as standard full game releases, which format do you think works best for the Monkey Island series?
I think it's a bit of a draw. I mean, the episodic conceivably works well with Monkey Island because there is this tradition of bopping from island to island to island in Monkey Island that makes, serialized. Seems like, oh yes, now it's Tuesday, we're over here on fill in the blank island and we've got to do these quests. And plus, there's there's a little bit of, at its best when Monkey Island's steering into its, roots. a little, actual pirate adventure as opposed to, anti-capitalism screeds. It's there's it feels natural to be in a serialized state for those stories. That said, they're also epic adventures, and having a solid beginning, middle, and end with, one antagonist and not this, sort of herky-jerky, okay, now we're doing this thing over here. Wait, how's it connecting to the overall thing again? It helps to be telling one story at a time. So I think it's a draw. I think it's a wash. I think either can be good. I think in Tales there is, we had like 3 or 4 different writers, and occasionally it kind of showed. The tone was significantly different in some of them, but that's okay. As Ron spelled out in Return, it's a character that can bear lots of different approaches. So, whereas I think Sam and Max are perfectly situated for serialized stuff. I mean, their comic book adventures are like 7 pages each, for God's sakes. You put them in a long story, and all of a sudden it's like, shouldn't this be over already? So that's that's what I got.
You also worked on Back to the Future, the game. What was it like to work with Bob Gale on the project, and what were some of the things, if any, that Bob Gale helped revamp to give the game its Back to the Future feel?
Well, first of all, Bob Gale's great. Bob is a hoot. Bob takes his role as caretaker of the Back to the Future franchise quite seriously, and in a wonderfully in a wonderful way that only a solid Hollywood curmudgeon could do. He's wonderful. He got us steered straight from the start. We originally pitched an idea where the lead character was going to be Marty's daughter, teenage daughter, basically, and there was going to be hijinks involved with her going back 30 years, right? You could revisit 1985 and so forth, right? Made a lot of sense to us, we thought, and Bob put his foot down. No, it's got to be about Marty. It's got to be Marty's story. So that's how he immediately steered us back to, okay, well, what are we going to do with Marty? And very quickly we settled on, no, but we don't know anything about Doc as a teenager, so let's go there and have Marty get a fuller appreciation for his mentor, and do all that stuff, and gave us an entire main time era to work with there back in the teens. And so he pushed that along, and that was major contribution. He also course corrected us on a couple gags that he felt were a little too saucy, which is weird coming from considering Back to the Future. My favorite Bob Gale story was, you've played the game, I assume.
Yeah, I played.
You know how it opens. Yeah, it opens with basically a pretty straight retelling of the mall scene until something goes really bad. Mm-hmm. And and we were a full-on PG rated, PG-13 rated game, right? And
you have shit in there.
And we have shit in there, and I was in the recording session for that first episode with Christopher Lloyd in there. We were making a big press thing of it, so Gale was down there and Christopher Lloyd, and I was nearly killing Christopher Lloyd because I had too many multi-sentence lines jammed together rather than breaking them up, but that's a different story. And so, but Christopher Lloyd's going through this again, because he knows these lines by heart, and he's reading them and does when this car gets to 88 miles an hour, you're going to see some serious shit. And Bob Gale stops and goes, wait, I didn't say that. That's not my line. And everybody in this recording studio is looking at Bob, that's the line in the movie. Here, bring up the YouTube. We'll show it. And he's like, Bob Gale could not believe that he had actually written that line. It's just like, okay, that's interesting. That's my favorite Bob Gale story. But it was great working Bob Gale. It was great working for Christopher Lloyd once we figured out how to not to destroy an actor by, because he's got all that scientific gobbledygook that he's got to say. And you got to, whenever you get an actor who has to say that stuff, you got to chop those lines up, man, or else they'll go crazy. And it was great, and we got Michael J to actually come out for the final episode, which was wonderful. And he was very generous with his time and doing just a nice little cameo at the end. That was a fun project. It got a little somewhere the budgets and the time crunch somewhere around the fifth episode started getting a little hairy. So like we had a really short fifth episode because of it. But in the end, I was really happy that we pulled it all together and came up with a nice parallel to Marty's parents falling in love with each other and Doc falling in love with science. That was, we wanted to tell the story of Doc falling in love with science. And I think, in the end, we landed and we got to the, somewhat the essential heart of Back to the Future. And only, completely broke a few timelines in the process. It was hard. We had to, every day, it seemed like I had to tell someone, ignoring Back to the Future 2 for a minute because it didn't follow its own rules. You cannot have predestination paradoxes in the Back to the Future universe. It's not allowed. You are not allowed, because there are constantly people are trying to propose puzzles where, and then Marty finds the thing that he's going to go back in time and plant earlier. No, that doesn't happen. We are not working with Bill and Ted rules here. It's, that's a different timeline every time he goes back. So he doesn't get to do that. And people were constantly ticked off at me for trying to hold the line there on that, because I didn't want to have Bob Gale telling me that I coming back angry at me at that.
Well, in the end, it was a great game. I really like it. I considered it as the official fourth entry in the Back to the Future series, just as I consider Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis as the official fourth entry in the Indiana Jones series.
It's amazing how people say that about Fate of Atlantis. It is one of the other things that makes me happiest about my career, is that so many people think, yeah, if they'd just done Fate of Atlantis, that would have been a good movie. It's like, well, yeah, I'll take that.
Yeah, and after Fate of Atlantis, Crystal Skull came out, and so people still think that Fate of Atlantis is much better than Crystal Skull. So it's still the official fourth entry. And now with Dial of Destiny, I still think that Indiana Jones and Fate of Atlantis is better than both.
I think Dial of Destiny is one of those movies that there's a whole where afterwards my wife turns to me and said, that was fine. I'm not sure why they had to make that, but that was fine. It's like Dial of Destiny is like, yeah, okay, I get it. Yeah, okay, it's pretty good. A couple of things a little wonky, but, perfectly serviceable summer action movie is what that, and, it's weird. I it's one of those things I worry that my sense of wonder and whimsy has been sanded off over the years, where I don't quite get the wow factor of watching things anymore. It's like, oh, there's some spectacle going on here. Why am I not, jazzed by this? I mean, the last time I probably felt it really was, and this is, totally basic, but, Avengers Endgame, the leading into the final battle, you're going, okay, there, you've got the culmination of 20 movies right here. If you're not feeling anything at this point in a rah kind of way, you must be dead, because look, it's all been leading to this. If you can't get yourself excited right at this instant, even though it's all gonna, be cheesy CGI battles after this, why are you watching a summer movie in the first place?
Well, it's easy to think that since people are getting old, then they don't like to watch any new movies, or they don't relate to them, or they cannot be introduced to anything new, regardless of when it was made. But it's not true. If you find a movie from the 1990s or the 1980s that you watch for the first time nowadays, you may relate to it better than you would to a new movie from 2023. It's not because it had any better special effects because it was the 80s and the 90s. It was because there was more emphasis on storytelling, and nowadays there's more emphasis on spectacle.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it really depends. I mean, there are a lot of spectacle movies where the storytelling is shaky at best. But, there's also things like, Pixar movies. All of them, with a couple of exceptions, all of them just like, wow, it's a good story, well told. But in recent years, I've come to it's a horrible thought, but I've come to become slightly irritated by the knowledge that as I watch this movie with its watchcraft. I mean, basically, they're these perfectly crafted little gems of stories where that 8 people sat in a room and go, oh wait, should we keep this line or should we get rid of this line? Keep it, maybe make it with 2 words, because they've worked them down to the bare essential of this is what the story is. Every line needs to fit properly. That there are these little clockwork things, and I'm much more interested in a little more storytelling slop. Now, of course, it's not fair. In animated movies, every minute's $10 million, so there's a reason things get cut down to the bare essentials, right? But even in your well-crafted summer action movies, there's just feels like, where's that extraneous 50 seconds of people just doing goofy stuff to get across who they are, right? Or maybe even not that, just to have something interesting and odd happening. And I like stories that are a little sloppier these days. I say that, and then I go and watch, the next Avengers movie. But
yeah, but when you say sloppier, like, it doesn't necessarily mean bad storytelling or bad writing. It can mean that a scene, instead of being edited perfectly at the beginning of the scene, something's happening, and at the end of the scene, it's whenever that thing that was happening ended. You get a little more room to breathe. You get 10 seconds before or 20 seconds after to let the scene resonate,
and not let the scene resonate, and not everything in a scene, or every scene for that matter, needs to be something that's paying off later in the story. Sometimes things can just be. And it's hard. I mean, and I know it's hard. It's hard when you're like, I'm the 15th movie in the 20 Marvel movies, and I've got to set up 3 more movies, and I've got 8 characters running around. I can understand why it's hard to let those things sit. But, it's as a random example, it's like, I can't think of the scenes, but, Barbie's a wonderful movie. Barbie's a wonderful movie, and it has stuff in there that's just kind of ridiculous and doesn't really. And some of those bits with the Mattel bosses go a little longer than they absolutely need to, and are just kind of there because, hey, we got Will Ferrell on the set this week and he's doing goofy stuff, so let him do a little more goofy stuff, and that's good. It shows. It's a director that's, trusts her own voice enough to, let things run, rather than having it, polished down to a perfect gem. that's kind of so that's why, like I said, I think I may be just getting. It's one of those things as I've gotten decent at writing over the years, as opposed to when I was just throwing stuff up against the wall. Is I talked to Hal about this in the past years ago. Is man, the more you can see of the little strings of storytelling, the more irritated you get by things that are, by anything, little vexing things. You start seeing how it all works, and you go, oh, okay, well, yeah. It makes it hard to get surprised by a perfectly set up twist. That's the one that really annoys me. It's like, because a perfectly set up twist should be really, actually, in hindsight, really obvious. So if you pick up more and more skills as a writer, you go, oh, yeah, I can see where this is all going now. And that's good because they're doing it right. They're foreshadowing and they are dropping the little dollops of things. But, unless it's a really good murder mystery kind of thing, it's much harder not to see things as they're happening, which takes some of the enjoyment out of things.
Speaking of stories, you've mentioned in the past that you don't think that stories are games. So what do you think about
stories
the fact that what do you think about the fact that a lot of the adventure games released nowadays and a lot of the games released by Telltale after The Walking Dead were basically games in which the narrative was the core mechanic?
I think especially, it's interesting because some of those early year Telltale games were definitely struggling with this, because they helped that they were doing a lot of comedy stuff. And comedy, you can be a little bit more relaxed about your story. They were still working with this, classic adventure game rubric. We're going to go wander around rooms, point and click a lot of stuff. The story will flow forward as you solve puzzles. And the rhythm of it didn't matter that much. And that's, and even then, the question of whether those were truly games is, is an adventure game truly a game is a question that, should, something to ponder in the long run. But then, they hit upon this Walking Dead thing. And from that point forward, I'm willing to make the break. And I keep saying that all those games, those post-Walking Dead era games at Telltale, are wonderful pieces of interactive fiction. And I bet you if you pin down Bruner for, a few minutes, and he would, probably was vexed by the fact that why did we call our company Telltale Games? Because at that point, they're not really making games anymore. They're making these nice pieces of art, but I don't think they fit any classical definition of game. And, even the one that was straining under the old adventure game style. And that's okay. It's a different thing altogether. And the Telltale should be celebrated for championing that. And back to my original quote that I give, games are not, stories are not games. Games are not stories. You tell stories about games. You can have games that have dollops of pieces of stories in them to help move them along. But, and that's, you can have an emergent story coming from those little pieces of story that you put inside a game. But they're separate things. At the gross level, we don't, a baseball game is not a story. We tell a story about what happened in the game. A story can emerge from the telling of the game. The guys hit a home run in his, first 3 at bats. The story that emerges is he's got 2 more opportunities to hit a 4th and maybe even a 5th home run, and that would be a heck of a story. But it's not the game itself. That's kind of the bare bones level. So it's important to keep those separate. I've gotten much more interested in games anyway, and having, the story that weaves in and out and doesn't take much of your time. For the Sam & Max VR game, I completely violated that and had a story that's going through, but it's weird anyway because it's first person and so it's different. But particularly for telling serious stories, high drama, you have to get out of the way of the game and let the game do what it's got to do. And it gets harder and harder. Like I said, going all the way back to when we first started putting voice in. The greater the verisimilitude of the game, the harder it is to tell a singular story while still being a game. It gets ugly. So yeah, and of course now I'm doing something that doesn't involve stories at all. So that makes it easier for me.
And have you played any adventure games recently? I understand that you played Return to Monkey Island because we talked about it.
I have not played Return yet. I've got to. I'm getting my kids set up for it. I have read reviews and I have read synopses. Isn't that horrible? I've got to actually sit down with it when I get a few hours.
You know about the ending of Return from reading about it and not internet. Actually playing?
Not watching a few cutscenes. That's about how much. Isn't that horrible? I don't have time. I don't play many games these days. I am addicted to Pokemon Go because it gets me out of the house and walking. I watch my kids play a lot of Fortnite. I mean, just way too much Fortnite and other things. But I don't get free hours to play a lot of games these days. I'll probably sit and play Return with the kids once I talk them into it. They've got to go through a couple more Monkey Island things. But then I play VR games because it's part of part of my gig now. I should keep up a little bit on VR. But even there, I let the kids do most of the playing because, I've got to get my heads down and study clinical things.
Now, before we conclude our conversation, I have two questions from Casey Adventure, who's the current world record holder of the Escape from Monkey Island speedrun.
Yep.
First question. The monkey combat and true-false parrot puzzles feel very, very abstract and mathematical. Did you have any interest in these kinds of mathematical, logical puzzles at the time?
I always have an interest in mathematical and abstract puzzles. I almost was a math major in college, and like I said, to my detriment, as I said before, I thought that the abstraction of monkey combat was much more fun and amusing for the player than it was, because it was amusing to me, which, in my early years, I did do a lot of game design that was mostly just things that I found amusing. So I have a great interest in logical puzzles. What I love about certain abstractions, doing abstract puzzles in adventure games, is you can have a high degree of replayability in them. There's an opportunity to mix them up, randomize them. I always encourage in my design, and whenever I'm talking to young designers, to anything that you can systematize, hopefully in a clever way and not in a blandly abstract way, anything you can systematize to be random the next time they see it, anything that can increase delight the next time the player is playing something, whether it's an adventure game or a shooter or even a clinical VR game where you're just reaching for birds to improve your arm strength. Anything you can do to make it so that the player or patient sees something that they did not see the first 10 times they played it. That gets to the Battlefront 2 dialogue issue. It's like, if there's a chance that they're going to hear something they haven't heard before and it will make them chuckle or go, whoa, or something like that, always do that. Especially if you've got text. Text is cheap. You should always do something funny and random with your text. So, yeah, I'm interested in logic puzzles, always have been.
Well, logic puzzles and random puzzles are problematic for speedrunners, just so you know.
And that's another reason I like them. It's like, if they have to actually stop and think for 20 seconds in the middle of their speedrun, I have won. because part of my other impulse that never really goes away when you're a designer is the screw the player impulse. We would occasionally, in the early years at LucasArts, we indulged in that way too much, as opposed to the later Telltale years, which is all about hand-holding on our journey.
Not as much as Sierra. Sierra really hated their players.
Yeah, but yes, they did. But we would. I'm all in favor of randomization as a confounding element for design to make people, because especially with adventure games, because adventure games so often do boil down to, unfortunately, check everything with my inventory with everything else and see what happens. If you can get to a point where, well, I know I got to do a thing here, and I know that it involves these cards, but I got to look at what's actually there and then run it through this little matrix of, okay, if it's one of these, it's one of those, and if it's one of these, it's one of those, and now I can do this. That's good. You've got the player intellectually engaged and thinking about a puzzle rather than just doing some rote point and clicking.
And the second question, it's very noticeable in Monkey Island 4 that characters say heck instead of hell, even to the extent of the strange term demonic heckfire. Was this a conscious decision that all writers decided to follow, or just the sensibilities of a single writer?
It's probably the latter. We certainly weren't stopped from saying hell.
After creating Afterlife.
Certainly... In some cases, heck is funnier. Heckfire is somewhat funnier than hellfire just on the face of it. But I hadn't noticed at the time that we were doing it. It's probably true in a game that large. It's one of those things that was always embarrassing, is the going through a long play of a game and realizing you're practically telling the same joke twice and you didn't even notice it at the time. I hate it when that happens. It's all the more reason to have a paid editor on your giant games so that, somebody's going through and noticing, hey, you told that joke already. Yeah, I think in the VR game I told a joke twice, and I'm really unhappy about that. Can't remember which one.
Well, you can always release a patch. It's 2023. Release a patch.
There's a patch with the... No, we're not doing patches. I've pretty much, aside from the weird idea that freelance police might come out someday, I think I'm officially in Sam and Max hibernation until the 8th to 10th anniversary of the VR game, at which point we'll be doing Sam and Max chips in your head games. That'll be the next
2031.
2031 is when I'm due. I will be 64 years old. I'm not sure I can do Sam and Max when I'm 64.
Why not?
I should be sipping Mai Tais on a veranda somewhere and collecting Social Security by then. Or probably
and
still
one
down
last
in
question
here.
from me.
Sure, hit me.
What are your plans for the near future, apart from the Sam and Max sequel 8 years from now?
The near future, I am currently employed at a wonderful company called Penumbra Inc. that, although it primarily makes really cool medical devices like those little snaky probes that they sneak up into people's brains when they're having strokes that take care of their blood clots, and that's just staggering. They also have this burgeoning VR department that does wonderful little activities for patients who are recovering from strokes, patients who need to be doing physical or occupational therapy, all this wonderful stuff. And so now I'm basically down there with a group of brilliant designers and artists and engineers, a lot of ex-Lucas people, actually. Steve Chen, Mai Win, other people like that who, have come together, and we're just making these nice little activities, and it is definitely a future of physical and occupational therapy. And so I plan on doing that for goodly while now, and basically helping some of the many people I've injured over the years. Probably I've broken a few brains, and I'm going to help them out get better now by doing all these nice little things in VR. It's interesting crafting these tiny little jewels of games, which are not not involved with micropayments or trying to make a multi-billion-dollar hit or anything like that. No, just things to help some people. That's where I want to be for a while. It seems like a good way to head towards retirement, at least until some other LucasArts expat calls me up and says, "Hey, we're doing Sam & Max for the PlayStation 8. You want to do that?"
Or someone decides to remaster Escape or release 7 Max to Last Police.
I think remastering Escape I could probably do on the fly. I could just sort of do that as a side project with somebody who actually has some money and and is willing to run that. I don't really need to run that project. I just want to be asked to be a part of it if it ever happens.
Well, I'm willing to back that Kickstarter project if it ever becomes one.
I'd be interested to hear what people think could be changed aside from let's do it all in 2D and whatnot. I would actually not mind hearing a full-on game jam around. Okay, so we're going to keep 90% of it, but what would you change design-wise? That would be a really the fix the third act of Escape from Monkey Island challenge would be really interesting. I'd get behind that too.
Yeah, why not? Kick that hornet's nest.
It's important to occasionally rip the Band-Aid off and let the wound fester a bit more. Let's see. Do you have any other questions for me today, Daniel?
No. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for taking the time to join me for this conversation today. It's been an absolute pleasure to take a trip with you down memory lane.
It has been an unalloyed pleasure as well, Daniel. I hope I was able to illuminate some things through my misty, foggy memory. And I think we covered most of my actual anecdotes from the LucasArts days, except for the ones I can't tell anybody ever.
Well, once the NDA runs out in a decade or so, or 20 years, we'll have another conversation. By that time, you'll have another Sam & Max sequel ready. So
that might be a good time to check in.
Yeah. So August 30th, 2032.
August 30th, 2032. It is a date. I will be there. All right.